Hello, let's talk about another passage today briefly. This passage has 3 parts to it, and it mentions 3 types of government. Can you name them for me? Right away, in the first part, you have aristocratic, after semicolon. In the same vein, we have oligarchic. And the third type of government which is mentioned here is democracy. Now look how paper setter would play with your mind by giving the weight of the passage to something that you can relate with, which is democracy. In India also we have democracy, so to say. And a lot of you may have been able to relate to what's written here, which is the basic principle is the equal right of all to hold office and determine public policy. This is at first glance a delightful arrangement. It becomes disastrous. Note the word disastrous here, and note the word ruins on top of this page, and then the word ruins here again in the context of oligarchic government. So what I understand is there is a common theme running. What destroys a specific type of government? Now, coming back to the point, that is the next part of the passage, although talks mostly about democracy and what is required for it to be successful, or in other words, what destroys it, why it doesn't work well, we have the reason it becomes disastrous because the people are not properly equipped by education to select the best rulers and the wisest courses. The people have no understanding and only repeat what their rulers are pleased to tell them. Such a democracy is tyranny or autocracy. Many of you would have drawn parallels to the governments in India. I know that's a good thing to do. We can always connect the dots and relate the passage, but we have to answer this question, and the question instruction says, which one of the following statements best reflects the crux? What's the gist of the passage? When you get what's the gist of the passage, it's not asking you to draw just a conclusion. It's saying what is the leitmotif, which is that theme that repeats itself the most in a way. Following statement best reflects the crux, but there is a way to look at question statements and then to come to a conclusion. What did you choose? A very obvious answer to this one seems to be, I'll give you a few seconds to look at the passage. Would you say option number 2 or option number 3, B or C? C ought to be the answer. However, is it the answer? That's what we're looking at. Why not option A and option D? Human societies experiment with different forms of governments. Is that the main point that this passage wants to prove? If not, if we don't see this coming again and again in the passage, then we rule this option out, which is the case in point here. So we rule this option out. Now, the next one is having a government is a necessary evil because tyranny is inherent in any form of government. Does this sound a bit extreme to us? Let's look at its Hindi version. शासन का अस्तित्व एक अपरिहार्य बुराई है क्योंकि शासन के सभी रूपों में निरंकुशता अंतर्निहित होती है. ऐसा नहीं लगता ये पेसिमिस्टिक है, एग्जैजरेट कर रहा है, ये कह रहा है कि सरकार कभी अच्छी हो ही नहीं सकती, ये जरूरी बुराई है क्योंकि tyranny जो है वो इनहेरेंट है, इसका स्वाभाविक नेचर है in any form of government. Because this has an extreme tone to it, the passage also talks about solution. The passage is not totally pessimistic. It doesn't say nothing can be done at all. It kind of gives us a hint. Perhaps Plato was a philosopher. He, Socrates, and all these philosophers wrote books for kings. And possibly they wanted kings to follow philosophers, their education, their philosophy. However, we are looking at these questions objectively, so we have to also carefully screen through the words so that there is nothing that is fatal. Any form of government tends to meaning not always, but has a tendency to. Does it talk about forms of government? Yes, 3 types. For example, aristocratic, oligarchic, and democracy. Tends to, I have a bad throat today thanks to the cold and winter, but I hope I'm clear. Tends to deteriorate by excess of its basic principle. You see the word excess, deteriorate. Going back to the discussion, you see the word disastrous, ruins. They tally with this one. Now we don't like it so much as we like option C. Education for all citizens. A lot of themes run in our head because we can relate to the democracy in our country and right of free education for all. So we happen to tally with this personally, on a personal level, a little more. We happen to agree with this more because we kind of experience this every day. The books and newspapers we read. So as candidates or as Indian students, we may have a tendency to choose this. But let's go a little further into this discussion and see the word ensures, make sures a perfect. Now the word ensures. Is it able to do it always? If every citizen gets educated, will democracy not be damaged? Will it not be ruined? That's the question we need to ask ourselves. Second, perfect. Is that possible to have a perfect government? Functional and sustainable democracy. Well, these are good words. But what about the first word? Does it happen to sound a little extreme? Ensures. Is it practical? So since option number C gives a very theoretical, idealistic, utopian type of option to us, one side of our head might say, okay, this was a philosopher, so why not? But then, when we look at these words in bold, best reflects the crux. We have to go by the theme that repeats itself in most part of the passage. That has to tally with aristocratic government and oligarchic government and democracy. All of these 3. In case we didn't have option number B, option number 2 or B, we would have gone for this. So now since we have it, this probably will make the best answer. What do you have to suggest, or what do you first thought when you looked at this passage? I'd like to hear from you. All the best.